Welcome back to Real Life Justice, where we share incredible true stories of people standing up against bullies and finding unexpected justice. Today's story will absolutely blow your mind. It involves fake police, a power-hungry HOA board, and a twist so shocking that even we couldn't believe it when we first heard it. What would you do if someone sent fake police officers to intimidate your family? What if those same people had been making your life miserable for months with ridiculous demands and threats? Well, stick around because this story has the most satisfying ending you'll ever hear, and trust me, you won't see this twist coming. Our story begins with David Chen, a 34-year-old software engineer, and his wife Sarah, a 29-year-old freelance graphic designer. They had just moved into what they thought would be their dream home in Willowbrook Estates, a seemingly perfect suburban neighborhood in Colorado. David was the quiet, analytical type who preferred solving problems with logic and patience, while Sarah was more outgoing and creative, with a fierce protective instinct when it came to her family. Then there was Margaret Winters, the 58-year-old HOA president who ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. Margaret was a retired real estate agent who treated the homeowners association like her personal kingdom. Her right-hand person was Robert Hayes, a 45-year-old insurance adjuster who served as the HOA treasurer and shared Margaret's passion for controlling every aspect of neighborhood life. Finally, there was Officer Jake Morrison, a legitimate police officer who had been unknowingly dragged into this mess, and Tom Phillips, Margaret's nephew who would play a crucial role in the deception. David and Sarah had saved for years to buy their modest two-story home in Willowbrook Estates. The neighborhood seemed perfect: tree-lined streets, well-maintained properties, and friendly neighbors. They were excited to start this new chapter of their lives, especially since Sarah was 3 months pregnant with their first child. The trouble started just 2 weeks after they moved in. David was in his home office, working on a complex coding project, when the doorbell rang. Sarah answered to find Margaret Winters standing on their doorstep with a clipboard and a stern expression. "I'm Margaret Winters, HOA president," she announced without so much as a hello. "We need to discuss several violations on your property." Sarah blinked in confusion. "Violations? We just moved in 2 weeks ago." Margaret consulted her clipboard dramatically. "Your mailbox is the wrong shade of black. It needs to be midnight black, not charcoal black. Your garden gnome is prohibited under Section 4.7 of the HOA guidelines. And that wind chime on your porch creates noise pollution." Sarah looked back at the tiny ceramic gnome her grandmother had given her and the small, barely audible wind chime. "These are really minor things. Can't we work something out?" "Rules are rules," Margaret snapped. "You have 48 hours to fix these violations, or you'll be fined $50 per day for each infraction." Over the following weeks, the demands became increasingly ridiculous. Margaret complained that their grass was a 1/4 inch too long. She cited them for having their garbage cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours. She even claimed their car was parked at the wrong angle in their own driveway. David tried to remain diplomatic. "Look, Margaret, we're happy to follow reasonable rules, but some of these seem excessive." "The HOA board voted on these regulations unanimously," Margaret replied coldly. "If you don't like them, you can move." The situation escalated when Sarah started receiving certified letters demanding fines for increasingly absurd violations. One letter claimed their doormat was too festive because it had autumn leaves on it in November. Another cited them for excessive holiday decorations. They had a single pumpkin on their porch. Sarah was stressed beyond belief. The pregnancy was already making her anxious, and Margaret's constant harassment was affecting her health. She barely slept, constantly worried about what new violation would appear next. "David, I can't take this anymore," she confided one evening, tears streaming down her face. "I'm scared to even step outside. What if she sees something else to complain about?" David put his arms around his wife, feeling helpless and angry. "We'll figure this out, honey. Maybe we should consult a lawyer." But Margaret wasn't finished. When the Chens didn't pay the accumulated fines, which now totaled over $800, she decided to escalate her tactics. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening in late November. David was working late at the office when someone knocked on the front door. Sarah, now 5 months pregnant and showing, opened the door to find 2 men in what appeared to be police uniforms. "We're here about the outstanding HOA violations," the taller man said, his voice stern and intimidating. "We need to discuss the legal consequences of your non-compliance." Sarah's heart raced. I don't understand. Are HOA violations really a police matter? The second man, shorter but equally intimidating, stepped forward. When fines reach this level, it becomes a civil matter that can lead to legal action. We're here to inform you that if these violations aren't resolved within 24 hours, you could face arrest for trespassing on HOA property. Trespassing. But this is our home. Not if you're not in compliance with the community standards, the tall man said. The HOA has the authority to revoke your residency rights. Sarah was shaking now, one hand protectively over her belly. Can I call my husband? This is a serious legal matter. We need you to sign this acknowledgement that you've been informed of the consequences. The shorter man thrust a clipboard toward her. Terrified and confused, Sarah signed the document without reading it carefully. After the men left, she immediately called David, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. David raced home to find his wife in a state of panic. They said I could be arrested, she kept repeating. They said we could lose our house. That night, David couldn't sleep. Something about the encounter bothered him. He'd never heard of police officers handling HOA violations, especially not threatening arrest for unpaid fines. The next morning, he decided to investigate. David's first call was to the local police department. Hi, I'm calling to verify that officers came to my house last night regarding HOA violations. The desk sergeant sounded confused. Sir, we don't handle HOA disputes. That would be a civil matter. What were the officers' names and badge numbers? David realized he hadn't gotten that information. His suspicions growing, he decided to do some research. He spent his lunch break at the courthouse, looking into HOA regulations and property records. What he found made his blood boil. There was no legal basis for anything the fake officers had claimed. But David was thorough by nature. He decided to dig deeper into the property records, curious about exactly what authority the HOA actually had. What he discovered would change everything. According to the county records, Willowbrook Estates had been developed on land that was originally owned by a company called Brookstone Development LLC. However, the records showed something interesting. A small parcel of land, about 2 acres right in the center of the development, had never been transferred to the HOA. It was still owned by the original company. David's programmer mind kicked into high gear. He traced Brookstone Development LLC through various corporate filings and discovered it had been dissolved in 1995. But according to Colorado law, when an LLC is dissolved, its assets don't just disappear. They transfer to the state unless claimed by legal heirs or successors. This led David down a rabbit hole of genealogical research. He discovered that Brookstone Development had been owned by a man named William Brookstone, who had died in 1994. William had one daughter, Elizabeth Brookstone, who had married a man named Robert Chen in 1960. David's hands trembled as he made the connection. Robert Chen was Sarah's grandfather. Elizabeth Brookstone Chen was Sarah's grandmother, the same grandmother who had given her the garden gnome that started this whole mess. According to the records, Elizabeth had died in 2018, and her estate had been settled without anyone realizing the significance of the undeveloped land parcel in Colorado. As Elizabeth's granddaughter and legal heir, Sarah had inherited not just her grandmother's jewelry and keepsakes, but also a 2-acre piece of land right in the middle of Willowbrook Estates. David spent the next week quietly consulting with a property lawyer to verify his findings. The lawyer confirmed what David had discovered. Sarah legally owned the land that the HOA's community center, playground, and main entrance were built on. The HOA had been operating on her property without permission for over 20 years. Armed with this information, David decided it was time to confront Margaret and her fake police scheme. He had identified the fake officers through some detective work. They were Tom Phillips, Margaret's nephew who worked as a security guard, and his friend Mike, who had borrowed a police costume from a local theater company. David arranged a meeting with Margaret, claiming he wanted to discuss paying the fines. Margaret arrived at the agreed coffee shop with Robert Hayes, both wearing smug expressions. Finally come to your senses? Margaret asked, settling into her chair with satisfaction. Your wife was quite shaken by the police visit. Smart of her to take it seriously. About that police visit, David said calmly. I have some questions. Margaret's expression didn't change. Questions? Well, I called the police department to follow up, and they have no record of officers visiting my house for HOA violations. In fact, They told me they don't handle HOA disputes at all. Robert shifted uncomfortably, but Margaret maintained her composure. Perhaps they were county officers, or from a different jurisdiction. I also checked with the county sheriff and the state police. None of them sent officers to my house. David's voice remained steady, but his eyes were cold. So I'm wondering who exactly did visit my pregnant wife to threaten her with arrest. Margaret's facade finally cracked slightly. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that you sent fake police officers to intimidate my wife. That's a felony in Colorado. Impersonating a police officer can result in up to 6 years in prison. The color drained from Margaret's face. Robert looked like he wanted to run. But David wasn't finished. He pulled out a folder of documents. However, I'm willing to overlook this criminal behavior because I've discovered something far more interesting. He placed the property records on the table. It turns out my wife owns the 2 acres of land that your community center, playground, and main entrance are built on. She inherited it from her grandmother, Elizabeth Brookstone Chen. Margaret's eyes widened as she scanned the documents. This is impossible. The HOA owns all common areas. Actually, you don't. This particular parcel was never transferred to the HOA. You've been trespassing on my wife's property for 20 years. David smiled coldly. Now, I calculate that fair market rent for 2 acres of prime suburban land with existing improvements would be about $3,000 per month. 20 years of back rent would be approximately $720,000. Robert choked on his coffee. Margaret sat in stunned silence. Of course, David continued. I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to negotiate a settlement. First, all harassment of my family stops immediately. Second, all fines are forgiven and refunded. Third, you resign from the HOA board. And fourth, you publicly apologize for sending fake police to terrorize my pregnant wife. Margaret found her voice. And if we don't agree? David's smile turned predatory. Then I'll file criminal charges for impersonating police officers, sue the HOA for $700,000 in back rent, and evict you from my wife's property. Your community center will be demolished, and I'll turn the land into whatever I want, maybe a nice big fence right across your main entrance. The meeting ended with Margaret and Robert agreeing to David's terms. Within a week, Margaret had resigned in disgrace, taking Robert with her. The HOA refunded all the fines they had collected from the Chens and several other families who had been similarly harassed. But the story didn't end there. David decided to hold a neighborhood meeting to explain what had happened. The revelation that Sarah owned the community land led to a complete restructuring of the HOA, with new leadership that focused on reasonable community standards rather than petty tyranny. Tom Phillips and his friend Mike were arrested for impersonating police officers after several neighbors came forward with similar stories. They both received suspended sentences and community service, but the experience taught them a valuable lesson about the consequences of bullying behavior. Sarah, meanwhile, decided to use her newfound property rights for good. She established a trust that would maintain the community spaces while ensuring they could never again be used as tools of harassment. She also set up a small fund to help other homeowners deal with overzealous HOA boards. The baby arrived healthy and happy in the spring, born into a neighborhood that had transformed from a place of fear and harassment into a genuine community. Sarah often joked that her daughter would grow up on land that had been in the family for generations, even if they hadn't known it. Officer Jake Morrison, the real police officer whose name had been used by the impersonators, became friends with the Chens and helped them establish a neighborhood watch program that actually focused on community safety rather than mailbox color enforcement. As for Margaret Winters, she moved out of Willowbrook Estates within 6 months, unable to face the neighbors she had terrorized for so long. The new HOA board implemented reasonable guidelines that focused on maintaining property values through community cooperation rather than fear and intimidation. David often reflected on the irony of the situation. Margaret's attempt to drive them out through increasingly ridiculous harassment had led to the discovery that they had more right to be there than anyone else in the neighborhood. The fake police visit, meant to be the ultimate intimidation tactic, had instead been the catalyst for uncovering the truth. The experience taught both David and Sarah valuable lessons about standing up to bullies and the importance of thorough research. David's methodical approach to problem solving, combined with Sarah's fierce determination to protect her family, had turned the tables on their tormentors in the most dramatic way possible. The moral of this incredible story is multifaceted. First, Bullies often overreach when they think they have all the power, and that overreach becomes their downfall. Margaret's escalation to fake police officers was the step too far that motivated David to dig deeper and uncover the truth. Second, knowledge truly is power. David's willingness to research and investigate, rather than simply accepting the situation, made all the difference. Too often, people accept authority without questioning whether that authority is legitimate or whether those wielding it are operating within legal bounds. Third, sometimes the solution to your problem is right in front of you, but you need to look at the situation from a different angle to see it. Sarah had always known about her grandmother's connection to the area, but it took David's systematic research to uncover the legal significance of that connection. Finally, the story demonstrates that justice doesn't always come from official channels. Sometimes, ordinary people armed with facts and determination can achieve more meaningful results than formal complaints or legal proceedings. Today, Willowbrook Estates is known as one of the most well-managed communities in the area, with an HOA that serves its residents rather than terrorizing them. The Chens still live in their dream home, and their daughter plays in the playground that sits on land her great-great-grandfather once owned. And somewhere, Margaret Winters is probably still wondering how her perfect plan to drive out the troublesome new neighbors ended up costing her everything. The answer, of course, is simple. She picked on the wrong family, and her own illegal tactics gave them the motivation to uncover a truth that changed everything. Remember, when faced with bullies and abuse of power, knowledge, persistence, and courage can overcome even the most intimidating opponents. Sometimes, the underdog has more power than they realize. They just need to dig deep enough to find it.